Hello and good morning. Of course, welcome to Mountain Standard Time here at the Western Standard. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and today I'll be talking in just a few minutes with John C Thompson. He helped found Civitas. He was a instrumental player in some of the strategic thinking, both for Canada's strategic defense, but as well as what was going on in the Harper government and what it might have been. Had conservatism been preserved and pursued. He'll have some hot takes for us in a few moments on what's going on right now when it comes to both at home and abroad on a variety of political issues. Never forget that we need your support here at the Western Standard. So either there's always the best kind of support, which is a subscription for us online, but you can also follow us on Facebook or you can follow us on YouTube. And make sure that you like and subscribe in order to boost up our numbers and help us show that there is an appetite for a free, independent voice in Western Canada. I'm going to bring up my opening statement here in just a moment, but I'd like to start with our sponsor, bright and early. We have the Resistance Coffee Company. Are you tired of political correctness and all of the things that so many woke corporations are doing in order to support various woke causes? Well, if you support Resistance Coffee Company and purchase their product, which can be done online, they're out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, you will be supporting a company that makes sure that when it does donate, it donates to causes that increase your freedoms, not decrease them. So again, support Resistance Coffee Company every chance you get and drink a hot cup of refreshing and awakening non-woke narrative thinking in the form of Resistance Coffee. So we're so thankful for their sponsorship, and we'll be talking about them again later, I'm sure. But on to an opening statement. We're going to kind of just briefly touch on a few different topics here. It seems like Israel might finally be losing Benjamin Netanyahu as their prime minister after 12 years. What does that have to do with sovereignty in the West? Well, actually, he was a pretty feisty guy, and he was definitely against the grain in the global consensus. And therefore, always keep in mind, the opposition and even his own party are finally uniting against him to oust Bibi, as he's called, a man who's been Teflon for years. Perhaps the recent conflict was the last straw. It might have appeared that Bibi wouldn't enjoy the new U.S. administration's supports, and now he's being put out to pasture, probably some of his own people working against him. Another point in the news that was brought up was closer to home. Justin Trudeau plans on visiting other countries for a G7 conference as well as a NATO meeting, but does not plan on quarantining after arriving at the airport. Ever since the federal government began mandating mandatory quarantine, people have duly noted when those in charge don't abide by their own rules. So apparently Justin Trudeau can leave this country, enter another country, and not have to quarantine. But if you go across the border near, well, I guess if you're in southern Alberta or if you're in southern British Columbia, because we got a lot of our population here in BC right next to the U.S. border, they love making milk runs because, milk in Canada is really expensive. I love my fellow farmers. I stand in solidarity with my fellow farmers, but the cost of milk in Canada is super expensive. So when I lived in the Lower Mainland, I definitely went to the States all the time to get cheaper milk. That's just what you do. But the point is that apparently that requires you to quarantine for 2 weeks on either side, but not this, not flying all the way to, I believe he's going to be in Davos and a few other spots in Europe for his meetings. And apparently he doesn't have to quarantine because it's rules for thee and not for me. We've got a few things on what's going to happen a little bit later in the program. We're going to talk about on Vancouver Island, the Fairy Creek debate has become hotter. So this is the old growth logging question. Are we going to continue to log old growth? Are we not? There's competing First Nations around this issue, a First Nation that's in favor of continuing the logging and a First Nation that isn't. So we're watching a kind of inter-scene battle, a fratricidal strife there of what's going to happen. And this is the thing, like I'm a status Indian. And as I've told you guys before, we're not all the same. We don't all have the same beliefs. I've had some people who have been very angry at me because of my particular beliefs, and it comes to both my religion, as well as where I stand on development, as well as I stand on the question of even Aboriginal sovereignty, let alone Western sovereignty. I've had a lot of people come at me over the years. So, we're not just a single monolithic force, and I think that needs to be noted. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the program. And finally, another thing that's still in the news and needs to be discussed more, I wrote my column on this the other day, is the residential school in Kamloops continues to be in the news. And so I brought it up. It'll be up in my column soon. Hopefully, they're just kind of looking it over right now, and they'll put it on the WordPress file up there. But the point that I'll make here is that we need to think about the fact that Aboriginals are still more likely to be seized than anybody else when it comes to child family services and that sort of thing. And so I think that that's the place to kind of take this outrage and make a difference. I think we need to rebuild as much as we can by whatever means necessary, and with economic prosperity and with proper healing from the scars left behind by things like the residential schools where that occurred. It didn't happen universally, and I'm always very clear on that caveat. But we need to rebuild the family. We need to rebuild the family regardless of your race, class, creed, or color. The family has been really denigrated, basically, really in a sense, since kind of halfway after the Second World War. And until we rebuild the family and build a world where the family can survive better and people can grow up in a stable environment, we're going to continue to have seizures of children. We're going to continue to have the institutionalization of people and of children. And we have to find a way to get around that. We have to find a way to stop that once and for all. So that's going to take a healing of the whole nation, not just one people group. In the end, as Westerners, the world remains a dynamic and changing place. Hopefully we learn to stay afloat in these tempestuous waters as we navigate our way to a freer, brighter tomorrow. I believe we have John waiting in the wings here. I thought I heard somebody log on. Somebody else. We had a notification. So we'll start right away then with, first and foremost, what's going on when it comes to First Nations. So there's an interesting thing here where when it comes to 3 First Nations are calling for a halt. We'll just bring that one up there. Just asking my producer for this. I am terrible at screen sharing and everything else. You don't want me to run the Skype meeting. Okay, you don't want me to run the Zoom meeting. I can barely figure out how to call somebody on Facebook. It's awful. But a call by First Nations to suspend old growth logging unlikely to end protests at Fairy Creek, because the problem is that the province has talked about a deferral. So John Horgan, for those of you who are watching this, especially from non-British Columbian parts of Canada, it's important to understand that logging in British Columbia is a very bizarre issue that traverses all sorts of political boundaries. So let's back up a step. The overarching problem with British Columbia is that it is just full of resources, but it fails to develop them all the way to their deliverable product. And the reason it fails to do that is that the people who usually run the resource industry or have their interest in it can make a ton of money off of the raw resources without having to employ a ton of people between the beginning of that raw resource and the shipping it overseas where it actually gets processed and shipped back to us. Now, this wasn't always the case in British Columbia. A lot more raw resources, were actually processed here at one point. In fact, we used to, we've always shipped raw logs, but it's actually increased. And not just as a percentile of it took 10 men to bring down a tree back in 1890, and it takes 1 man to bring down a tree in 2021. No. It's as a percentage of what we're doing with our logging industry. We are shipping more raw logs today than by astronomical amounts, orders of magnitude higher than we used to. And the reason that this causes a lot of offense in BC is kind of like, again, referencing somebody who I actually have him on my sticker here, but, like President Trump was always arguing for the working class, the forgotten man, the guy, the wage earner who was trying to just support his family. What's happened in British Columbia is while most people in the resource industry, yes, they're conservative and they're right wing for the most part, they're certainly populist often. The problem is that their right wing government under the BC Liberals was shipping a lot of their jobs overseas. So there were a lot of mills that closed while the BC Liberals were in charge. A lot of secondary and tertiary industry jobs linked to logging, linked to resource extraction, that went away. And so the issue becomes that there's this bizarre populist element in British Columbia that can't really hang out with the main right-wing party, or has lots of suspicions of it because they feel like they didn't get treated very well during their 16 years in power. And this becomes an ongoing tension inside of the right-left dynamic of British Columbia. And it even shows up when it comes to Aboriginal issues. With Aboriginal issues, there's very real conflicts between those Aboriginal groups, which are benefiting from resource extraction, and those that either aren't or are effectively being funded, usually by foreign interests, in order to oppose resource extraction. Now, it's funny too, because in British Columbia, there's two different camps here on a few different issues. And one of them is that the same people who might protest a pipeline might actually be very pro-logging in some respects, a certain kind of sustainable logging, and they might have lots of caveats around that. But it's not always the same people that are standing in front of the pipeline that ought to have been built from Alberta a long time ago. I'm not arguing with that. But it's funny because, again, I mean, I think it comes down to the fact that oil just doesn't look as pretty as trees. That's a reality. Trees are pretty, and trees are, they are macro agriculture, right? You grow a tree for X number of years, you get lumber from it, you get timber from it. It helps the environment with what it's breathing in and breathing out. And the issue is that we British Columbians, we really like our trees, and we have, of course, there is plenty of oil and gas here, but we have the same understanding of it as Albertans do, because it's mostly sequestered to kind of one corner of the province, which actually runs on Mountain Standard Time. It runs on your guys' time zone, not ours. And so the funny thing is that when you're looking at what's going on in British Columbia, again, like I said, not the same people are protesting the same things, and it even divides the Aboriginal community. You think it'd be kind of monolithic, right? Well, all the Aboriginals are against both pipelines and logging, or they're anti-development, or they just want the development for themselves, etc. Like, there's a lot of criticisms like that get surfaced all sorts of places, including British Columbia. Well, that's not the case. In this case, especially when it comes to Fairy Creek, we have an Aboriginal group, one that is running the mill, that is doing doing most of the changes, most of the wealth benefit from the local logging, which is owned by a First Nations group, and then at the same time, probably competing interests of land claims, to be honest with you. It's another First Nations group that is probably not seeing that wealth, or is being supported by ulterior motives, by an ulterior system. The problem is just that. You have people who are on competing sides of the fence. And this is the thing about BC. I keep trying to explain this to people, particularly in Alberta, that it's just not the same thing. It's just not the same thing. We have such a diverse kind of part of the country because we're just also divided from each other by these river valleys, and they just don't get along, except in opposition to one another in a lot of ways, and then finally in opposition to the rest of the country, and even at times in opposition, I'm sorry to say it, to our brothers and sisters in Alberta. Go to the comments here for a second. We've got the Albertan who would like to remind us that to run the kilns at dry lumber, you need oil. To make OSB and plywood, you need resins and adhesives made from oil. The two industries are linked. I'm not arguing this for a second. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm simply saying that, just like, here's an interesting reversal. So I had a buddy who actually ran for the nomination here in the Tories when Dick Harris stepped down. He was, he'd had his time and he decided to go off and live, I think, in Arizona or something. He's certainly off in some sunshiny part of the world. I want to be clear that that's not me being mean to Dick Harris. I don't think anybody should live in any shiny parts of the world. If you're from the cold part of the world, I think you should learn to live in the cold part of the world. And that was the way I was raised. Going to sunny places was heresy in my family. You learned to love winter. Grow up. Anyways, the point is that what happened was Dick Harris stepped down, right? He was part of the class of 93. He was part of the reform movement. And what happened was his seat was finally up for election. Well, of course, this seat's been going Tory since Confederation. So everybody competes for the nomination because it's all but a shoe-in to get your election. And one of the people who competed for that was my buddy, Nick Fedorkiw, who did an amazing job of trying to articulate a sort of, in my opinion, a very brilliant kind of fiscally conservative, but still ecologically aware version of a conservative idea. And he wasn't arguing against pipelines at all. That wasn't it at all. In fact, he was turning the screws and turning the tables on people arguing against pipelines, particularly Andrew Weaver on Twitter, who the former leader of the Green Party in British Columbia, who, of course, was going on about the tar sands and their toxicity and blah, blah, blah. And he turned it around on him to point out that there was actually more land taken up by the dams in British Columbia, the water, right? The water that floods the land. That's usually arable land too, right? In British Columbia. That was more square footage. That was more square miles than all of the oil sands combined, including the reclaimed land. So, the thing that needs to be noted here, is that, again, just because it looks pretty, people get on side with it, right? Everybody thinks that the black rifle is wrong, right? An AR-15, it must be an assault weapon because it looks mean and scary and it's in movies. Well, actually, the exact same rifle with the exact same round, the same kind of action, right? You show it to people done up in a wood frame. All of a sudden, everybody thinks it's cute and nice and it looks like grandpa's gun. Doesn't matter that, again, even grandpa's guns, more of those have been used in more wars than any of the modern sporting arms have. Why? Because all modern wars are very small compared to our old wars. So that doesn't matter to people, though. It doesn't matter. People like images. And so the irony is that, again, trees, they look green, they look nice. You can give them a big hug. Oil derricks, they don't look at nice, and people get kind of upset about it. They get upset about pipelines and big piles of mud as people are pushing a pipeline through. They get upset about it, and that's where and it gets really weird because it isn't the same people in front of both things. It's a very weird kind of diverse oppositional thing in British Columbia. It's really hard to get a handle on, and I understand why it's so frustrating to you Albertans. We're going to shift a little bit here into the question of COVID. We're finally in British Columbia. It looks like we're actually on the mend to a point anyways. We've got, let's see here. Apparently we're going to get a little bit more freedom. I don't know how true this is. I don't know. I think that I was actually in a news conference this morning, like in a meeting this morning. So I had every morning, the Western Standard has all of its editorial guys and all of its news guys all come together and they just talk via Zoom for a couple of minutes. And it's basically our toolbox meeting. It's kind of foreign to me. I think it's actually very Albertan because for us British Columbians, I mean, we kind of do a weekly update. Sometimes it's like every now and again, it's like you touch base, like, oh yeah, no, I mean, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Like, looks like there's still trees to log and there's still gas to extract. And there's still, I don't know, there's still a street to walk on. We got some paint to put on this road. Like it is just a little more laid back. I think with Alberta, with the oil culture and with how many of you guys have ever worked in the rigs and how it's just safety all the time. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it just, with that intensity, I think that makes it different. And people come together in toolbox meetings and who knows what else all the time because it's like, no, like, I mean, there must be like this safety meeting, this touchstone, maybe even has to do with the fact that Albertans are in general more religious than British Columbians. It's like, oh, we got to have our meeting. Time for morning. It's not Sunday meeting, but it's every meeting, every day meeting, Sunday meeting every day. The point is, though, we have this meeting in the morning. And we talk about what are the issues of the day. And what was really interesting is that the other guy who's working out of BC here and the guy who kind of does their social media, monitors the Twitterverse and tries to figure out where the hot stories are so that he can direct the rest of us columnists and everything else to where the hot stories are to try and pick them up. The funny thing was that I believe, I think it was Derek. Derek said something effective like, oh, what's going on in BC? Why is there no pot stirring in BC? Like, come on, there's got to be controversy in BC. And make no mistake, like, I mean, the residential school thing, that's still an ongoing debate. Same with the Fairy Creek thing. There's a bunch of other stuff going on in BC. I mean, some of the leadership candidates in the BC Liberal race have got some very interesting things to say about a lot of this different stuff. So that's all real. But it just isn't the craziness of, I don't know, Kenny's rooftop diner party, whatever that was, or his little cocktail party he had up there, which was unfortunate. Again, I know the premier a little bit, very briefly. Back in Ottawa when I was interning with him, and I still don't understand what's going on over there. Like I had a lot of hope in Mr. Kenny, and I really don't understand what's going on with the premier. I think he's getting some terrible advice. The guy needs a reset. The point is that in this morning meeting, we were chatting about what was going on in BC and whatever else, and he was like, well, I want more lockdown stuff. Let's talk about lockdown stuff. Let's get more lockdown stuff out there. And let's talk about how BC has got some harsh stuff going on too. And the problem is British Columbia, as bad as some of the times ever were, make no mistake, I've railed against them and I will continue to rail against them. There shouldn't have ever been a lockdown. It didn't make sense. It didn't work. It didn't save any lives. And forcing people to get a vaccine is immoral, unconscionable, unethical, unconstitutional, and it's against our basic fundamental freedoms that we've been fighting for since Magna Carta and beyond. But the point that I would drive home here is that while Alberta was having basically a dumpster fire of a political time, with literal churches going up with fences and locks on doors and pastors being dragged, and that Polish guy who was yelling at the health inspectors that they were Nazis. Like, this whole thing, like, that was Alberta. In BC, it wasn't that there weren't rallies and protests, and there were like prayer meetings and on Sundays and stuff to try and show people we can do. And I know there were some fines handed out here, there, and everywhere, but I don't think it ever quite got to the same level as what's going on in Alberta. And I don't know why that is. I honestly have no idea why. Like, you'd think that BC would be more uptight about this stuff because it can be super sanctimonious. I absolutely agree. People from Alberta come over to BC, and especially in their more urban parts of British Columbia, they can feel like, wow, these people really think they're the center of the universe. It's almost as bad as Toronto. I can agree with you there. I can agree with you that in certain segments of our population in British Columbia, there's a very, and it actually is, I mean, not to throw the Ontarians under the bus too much, but honestly, it's Ontario's fault. I mean, we need to start having passports for Ontario and like only let a certain amount of Ontarians out every year, because let alone the Western sovereignty question, it's just, they unterrify everything. So you can't have that, and that's unterrifying. So it really does happen that way. My producer is giving me this look. It's like, that was a terrible pun and I hate you. That's okay. I've had to suffer through his puns many, many times. The point that I'm trying to drive home here, though, is that with British Columbia, I'm not saying that we didn't have some harsh moments. There's some terrible moments in British Columbia during the lockdown. But between the fact that we just appear to be opening up by default, nobody seems to care anymore. People all went to the cabin on the long weekend. Nobody cares. Nobody cares at all. And if you think that having Canada Day on a Thursday is going to stop a bunch of British Columbians from taking their Fridays off or calling in sick, yeah, right. The people are taking a 4-day weekend. There's no kidding. There's no question. So it looks like, to me anyways, British Columbia is just they're kind of over it, and they're not really worried about the lockdown stuff as much anymore. Like, it just kind of feels like it's disseminating. And it was just a really bad nightmare and a really bad experience. And I guess the short version of the story is that British Columbia just never had kind of the same ardor and the same earnestness around it that Alberta did. The Albertan had something to say about Kenny's thing there. I think he called it the hypocrisy luncheon. I should probably start taking a turn with this mouse here. I've got this mouse here. I should probably start taking a turn with it. It's not working. Never mind. I'm going to give that back to my producer. The point is that we've got John on the line here. We can get John on here pretty quick. But I just wanted to point out that there are a few different things up in the news. We'll talk about those more after we have our time with John. But we're going to talk a little bit specifically right now about what's going on in Israel, and is this finally the end? We've got John C Thompson on. John, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me again, Nathan.
I can't hear you, John.
Not you.
I gotcha. Never mind. Okay. That's on me. Go ahead, John. What's happening over there in the Middle East?
Well, as usual, everything's in turmoil, and it's hard to read the signs. Everything's bubbling, everything's changing, and it's sort of difficult to keep the currents. But in the main, like in Israel, the Israelis are still sorting out the new relationship they have with their own Arab citizens as a result of some of the rioting and protests that occurred during the war with Hamas. Hamas is still digging itself out of the rubble and playing the pity card as hard as it can. The Abrahamic Accords are still going, with Israel's new partners in the Persian Gulf, who still are very, very keen on improving relationships. The technical analysis from both sides is going on now, because Iran is deeply interested as to how its rockets performed and how to beat the Israeli defenses, and the Israelis are still working out, where Iron Dome worked and where it didn't. And then, of course, after all these years, Prime Minister Netanyahu is deposed, but who knows what's going to happen in the Knesset next? It is a mystery.
Maybe you can help our viewers and listeners understand just a little bit more about Bibi, as he's belovedly called by his fans and by his enemies alike, to a point. He's been there for 12 years, so he feels like he's been there forever. He's not been there as long as Putin, but he's been around for a while. And that's several U.S. administrations at this point, and as well as Canadian administrations have changed hands while he's been around. And kind of how did he get there, and how come he stayed in power for so long? Usually prime ministers in Israel don't last very long because it's such a dynamic place, and the people don't understand that their parliament is one of the most voracious places on earth.
It's interesting. If you've not actually ever been to Israel and walked inside the Knesset, I mean, it doesn't quite have the same sort of degree that you get of dignity and decorum that you might see in the Canadian Parliament, or we're supposed to see in the Canadian Parliament, or the British Parliament. It's more open, it's more inclusive. But on the other hand, Israeli politics have always been convoluted. Yet Netanyahu came along eventually as the leader of the Likud. He's been a political player for decades. But I suppose the best way to think of him is that he's got sort of the managerial instincts of Mackenzie King, the appeal to a great mass of Israelis that Trump had in the United States, and all sorts of combinations that have kept him in the head of the government for a long time. And the coalition that has finally knocked him off as prime minister consists of a number of people, especially from the left, the far right, from the Arabs. And it is about as unmanageable a coalition as possible. The only thing they could be united on is that they didn't like Netanyahu. Where they go from here, with the 6 or 7 different sets of hands all vying for the driver's wheel, who knows? All they know
sounds like a very crazy time. So I mean, Mr. Teflon is finally going away. Do you think some of that had to do with the fact that it didn't seem like he necessarily had the ear of this administration the way he had the ear of the last one when it comes to the United States? Israel depends on the United States very heavily for its defenses and for its economy. Do you think that was part of the reason why people said it was probably time to get rid of Netanyahu?
Not really. It's just Netanyahu had been hanging on by a razor's breadth for quite a while. I mean, the 2019, the constitutional crisis in Israel, and remember, the Israelis still don't have a written constitution. He barely hung on, and it didn't take too much to push him off. And right in the immediate aftermath, when the firing died down with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and to his opponents, it seemed like the right time.
Well, with him on the way out, do you think that's going to help stabilize things for Israel, or do you think that's actually going to destabilize the region, which already seems to be destabilizing ever since Trump left office?
Well, yeah, there are so many different factors in there. I mean, the internal Israeli one is that Israel itself, it's very hard for outsiders to get. And then somehow or other, they always manage to survive. There's always a consensus, it appears. Something will work out. There will be, the Knesset will go forward. A number of Netanyahu's opponents hate him. And again, like hating Trump in the United States, they have a number of things they like to charge him with. But at the same time, they realize that he's very popular with a huge streak of Israelis as well. He may, despite the fact that his different opponents despise him, he may retire very, very quietly and go on. Remember, he turned 72 this autumn, so it's also might be a mistake to write him off prematurely. He could come back. As for the United States, they're starting to figure out that there is a difference in the Middle East, especially between their political reality and what really happens in the Middle East. The Biden administration. Sorry, let me kill that.
Not a problem.
The Biden administration has been trying to warm things up with Iran, and they're beginning to increasingly notice that this is a profound mistake. That Iran is not rational when it comes to international diplomacy, and that by improving things for Iran, that's actually rekindling the regional wars in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and so on. And so they're starting of that dawning that, the democratic reality and reality on the ground in the Middle East are very different, and they've got to actually rationalize the two.
They really do. Looking at things from a wider scope, let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in these conferences that Justin Trudeau is going to. So, I mean, he's heading off. He's not going to quarantine. I guess he's immune to the virus in a way that we aren't. And he's just going to carry on. He's not a carrier or anything of that. He's just going to carry on to these events and talk with the leaders of the world about the situation. Obviously, COVID will be on the agenda. I'm sure global stability, a few other things. But what do you think is going to be brought up at that NATO meeting in particular? What do you look when you? I mean, you're the foreign policy guy that we get on this show. You know it inside and out. You're the one who's supposed to explain it to us. How do we understand it when these global leaders come together and actually have these conferences? Does anything get done, or is it all just for the cameras?
Well, remember, a lot of work is done ahead of time by the diplomats, by the civil servants. The time of so many national leaders is hard put on. So, they're there. Actually, often they're there for photo ops or to finally iron out some particular details. It's also important that they get to know each other. And the thing is, though, that Trudeau has really not represented us well for the last 6 years. And I look forward to new socks. And I look forward to new footage of him being steadfastly ignored or slightly snubbed by other leaders. Because the thing is, he's not a player. He likes to think he is, but he isn't. Remember, you've got a prime minister here who his model of the way to behave internationally is to act like a celebrity. And he's not one. And he just hasn't got the smarts that other people do. So he'll try, and there might be some good work done ahead of time by our civil servants and by some of our diplomats. But remember, they've been very heavily controlled by their prime minister's office, which thinks the same as Trudeau. So I mean, this is not going to be one of Canada's more stellar opportunities. We're not represented to the same degree that we were by any number of earlier prime ministers, including Justin's father.
It's really one of those. It's one of those confusing things about even what does it mean when Canada shows up to one of these conferences? Like, we have a very small population, an oversized country, and if you're looking at the military side, a rather underserved Navy and armed forces, where we don't procure things very quickly, and we use very old equipment that's got some real problems. And on the economic side of things, we continue to not do the nationalist thing when it comes to our economy. So we're lots of raw resources, but we don't have the manufacturing punch or pull to kind of really tell other countries what's what. What do we contribute when we show up to these conferences?
Well, traditionally in NATO, we actually demonstrated a bridge between the United States and the Europeans. That Canada had sort of a foot, but is the United States partner in North America, but at the same time that we had a better relations with a lot of European countries than the Americans have. That has been one of our traditional strengths. Other than that, it's consensus building. Again, one extra vote at the table and where things are going to go. Beyond that, of course, we'll probably we won't get hectored like we were under Trump, because almost everybody in NATO is actually underfunding their military, even the Americans. And there are new threats to be concerned with. And again, no sign that our current government really understands them. We've had troops that have been deployed in the Ukraine on training missions. We still have troops in the Baltic countries as a disincentive to the Russians to try anything adventurous. But they're pushing. And of course, the real threat and the real problem is what to do about China. And remember, Trudeau's got failing grades on both accounts. So,
Well, let's recall that that the Baltic countries aren't a thing, I believe was his famous line. He was doing a flashcard game with a bunch of young people, I believe, and as he whipped through them, they were like, the prompt was Baltic countries, and he said, "That's not a thing," and he just continued on. So maybe someone should remind him where our troops are, because he might not know that that's a thing. I think with the China question and with Canada in general, when it comes to security, what probably the big thing is fourth generation warfare, as you mentioned when we were in our correspondence back and forth, and cybersecurity. What how everybody's kind of still stuck because we're all watching movies that are still either made in the past or still made about the past because it's it's an easier and more romantic time to talk about. Saving Private Ryan is always going to be a better movie than watching some guy drive a drone around, right? Everybody knows that. So the problem is that in our time, things feel so disembodied when it comes to warfare, conflict, security, intrigue, infiltration. What do we need to think about when someone says the word cybersecurity or that there's been a breach? What does that even mean?
well, yeah, and we're playing catch up on both accounts. But remember, the whole new frontier in cyber warfare is that actually every society is vulnerable in some particular ways. The problem is that our public and our officials have still failed to really understand what some of the dimensions are. So you can have all sorts of players that are messing around with your power system or with your banks, and it's not actually seen as a threat. And people will not accept cyber warfare as a real threat until tens of thousands of people start getting killed by it. And remember, our the dependence that we have on computers has been growing and growing and growing. And if you look now, sort of 5G systems and the Internet of Things, people don't really understand that the new toaster and the new refrigerator that you have can also be gathering information about you, not just for marketing companies, but for other countries. The other point is that you might not imagine that your domestic appliances are taking part in a massive denial of service attack on, say, your power company. People don't really get their heads around this. Canada is still playing catch up, and because it's been one of our problems that we just don't get or take seriously some of the security threats that are out there. But if you look, the RCMP and various other Canadian government institutions are finally sort of coming out of the academic conference phase into actually spending money and building capabilities. But again, the debate in Canada has been sidelined because the government has preferred to pass a bill about control over what people say on the internet, which infringes on everyone's personal freedom. So once again, the Canadian public is sidelined and still doesn't really get the new situation. We mentioned it, fourth generation warfare is really what the war is, or the fighting between Israel and Hamas is about. Just by, I suppose, a quick primer, but if you look at the traditional metrics for how you win a war, the first generation was, are you in control of the battlefield? We are the masters of this. We have conquered this castle. We control the stretch of countryside. We won. The second metric was, did we kill more of them than they killed of us? In which case, okay, they have more casualties. We obviously won the battle. And in both cases, of course, you have a clear idea that, who the winner or who the loser is. The third generation is something that you think about in terms of, blitzkrieg, or airland battle, or the Russian deep battle concept. You're actually fighting against the enemy's morale. So you're not actually trying to conquer territory or to kill large numbers of them. You're trying to break apart and decouple their military system and prevent it from operating. That's what Blitzkrieg was about. You're paralyzing the enemy, and we saw the third generation warfare probably at its most textbook case in 1991 in the Gulf War, where the U.S. led coalition basically crushed the Iraqis in one of the most one-sided military victories the world has ever seen. Fourth generation is where the actual fight is over media impressions and public attitudes. And the Israelis found this out the hard way in 2006 during the confrontation with Hezbollah in Lebanon, because the Israelis were basically knocking out key facilities all the time. They were winning on the battlefield, but they had no idea that the real battlefield was in the news magazines and the television footage, a lot of which was staged and carefully doctored. And the Israelis suddenly found that their control of the media was very much old-fashioned. Journalists were allowed to go into safe areas and watch like artillery firing, and then sell that to their stations back home as live coverage. Where Hezbollah was, bringing the same granny out to 4 or 5 different houses to weep about how the Israelis destroyed them. And most people didn't even know, didn't even notice things like trees growing out of the rubble. There was the one journalist who got caught doctoring his photos, and so that his picture of Beirut on fire was actually turned out to be entirely artificial, and a number of other things. But Hamas understands that fourth generation much better than the Israelis do. And so again, a lot of the coverage that came out of the Gaza Strip was very, very distorted. And the effect, though, has been actually it's sort of rekindling anti-Semitism across the world. And a lot of people actually, are sitting there, and the Palestinians, on their pity pot, and sort of, these poor people crushed by this brutal regime. How terrifying. And the realities of the situation are far, far different. But they don't know it, because once again, Hamas has played the fourth generation better than anyone else has.
This idea of propaganda, this idea of controlling the narrative, it's not entirely new. I mean, it's more prevalent today because everybody has a device in their pocket, so you can really get your message out quickly. But I recall that even during perhaps, I think the first mass photographed war was actually the Civil War in the United States, the American Civil War, the war between the states, depending on where you're coming from in the States. And it was noted that even there, that whether it was even literally casualties on the battlefield that were kind of rearranged, sometimes to provoke an emotional response. This is not new. This has been around for 150 years. What's making it so much more effective now?
Well, the images come a lot faster. Matthew Brady photographs the American Civil War came months after, and again, they were not. I mean, they were powerful, but they weren't that powerful. People could make their own minds up. Nowadays, I mean, you sit there and you're catching feed within seconds, and the context is entirely missing. Often there is no context. So people draw their own conclusions based on their own preconceptions, and these are powerful because then again, you might find again immediate feedback. How do you feel about this? And you press another button, and you record your impression, or you let people know what camp you're in. The other point, of course, is that, and we've seen this in the last 2 weeks, fundraising. Almost every international aid group is sitting there throwing out photographs of what happened in Gaza, then handing out the tin cup and saying, "Please contribute. We got to rebuild this place." Where Israelis know that if you give Hamas water pipe and concrete, it goes in the tunnels, and the water pipe goes to make rockets.
Mm-hmm. No, it's and this is the reality, the divorce between what's happening on the ground and what's being projected on the screen. That was something that was brought up a lot, of course, in the recent American election, and it's still being brought up throughout the Western world. This divorce between reality and what's being put onto our TVs and into our internet feeds and that sort of thing. Is China ahead of us on this question? Are they fighting this fourth generational warfare much better than we are? And if so, what should we do about it?
Well, remember that the China, you've got absolute government control over the internet. And I mean, China is very old fashioned. Goebbels or Stalin would understand China very well. because they've created this huge machinery to make sure they have absolute control over what's reported to people. And occasionally we see it leak out. When at the start of the COVID crisis, when Wuhan got cracked down on hard to make sure that it wasn't that the disease failed to get out; it was too late, but that the narrative was absolutely controlled. So China thinks it's a lot less vulnerable to fourth generation warfare than it is. But on the other hand, again, if you go back and look at the classic propaganda, and everyone uses the word propaganda, and so few people have actually understood anything about it. But the classic book is Jacques Ellul's book, written in 1962, Propaganda and the Formation of Men's Attitudes. And if you've not read it, you should. But the thing is, he's talking about mid-20th century propaganda machines. And the point about the propaganda machines that existed in the middle of the 20th century is the propagandist had to understand something about his audience. You can weave a whole cloak of lies, but you have to hang it on a coat hook, which is partly true. And the Chinese do not get the rest of the world. They're culturally very insulated. They don't really understand. So there's their vulnerability to propaganda is very, very strong. Their ability to actually transmit it, very, very weak.
But there appears to be a huge amount of allies for China throughout the American political establishment, as well as the American media establishment, throughout the Western media. There appears to be this weird fetish for China and for what China is doing, as if people have completely ignored some of the things that have gone deeply wrong in China, including what's happening with the Uyghurs and what's happened with Tibet, what happened with Hong Kong. There's obviously China is acting in terrible, tyrannical, and even evil ways, and yet they still have defenders who are, I don't even know if they're getting paid by them or not, but they're certainly defending their cause.
Well, one of the features of propaganda, the way it is developed in the age of the internet especially, is that the new frontier in propaganda is that people propagandize themselves. The Russians understand this. If you look at the Russians putting in a lot of money, to internet trolls that went out there and started, Goebbels or Pravda back again in the 1940s. If they were trying to convince you of something, they controlled every access to point to information that you had and tried to get you to act in a certain way. You can't do that anymore. You cannot build a total consensus in any society. But what you can do under the new rules is disrupt any consensus. You can get individuals in the audience you're pursuing to follow their own interests and their own preconceptions and to propagandize themselves. So China's main advantages in propaganda is that a lot of Americans, a lot of Westerners still think of China in terms as the great frontier for business opportunities. Yeah, and they're blinded by possibilities that allow them to then convince themselves that they ignore things. The Chinese are cracking down the Tibetans, but they're a bunch of ill people. Who cares? They're cracking down the Uyghurs, but we don't care because there's money to be made. Once China opens up, I'll be worth billions of dollars. And they go on from there. The other point, of course, is that I hate to use the loaded terminology, but in this case, it's a small case L. The liberal idea that security threats are so old-fashioned that you can ignore them. And again, the idea that the Chinese are busy pushing a very, very colonialist, imperialist agenda on their immediate neighbors, it doesn't occur. And so they don't think about it. But those, like me, who pay attention to this, well, we're right wing or white supremacists, we're, apply what label you like, and therefore they can ignore us.
Something I bet that coming back to those conferences that are going to be had, I bet you something that's going to be brought up at least by Justin Trudeau, if not by, of course, by the current American administration, is the idea of ethnocentrism, ethnic nationalism being a new threat in the West. I bet that will be brought up probably at NATO, maybe even in the G7. But the idea, which actually goes back basically really to in Europe anyways, really into the 2008 2009 euro crisis, which is still ongoing. They've never solved the euro crisis, but ever since then, the native population, though it was dwindling in Spain, dwindling in France, dwindling in Italy, they had a declining birth rate for years in all of those countries, Catholic or not. They suddenly recalled kind of some of their maybe their bad history or their bad tendencies, but certainly started to also have questions around having massive immigration from the third world, particularly from North Africa, from the Muslim world in the Middle East and even Turkey. And they started to react to that. And so obviously a certain amount of ethnocentrism and ethno-nationalism began. And some of it was based on race, some of it based on religion, some of it just based on sense of place. And then now in America and even in Canada, perhaps this same idea is being brought up as a threat. I don't really see it as a threat here, but they're definitely using that talking point. Do you think that'll be brought up at the conference? And what do you think they might do about it?
Undoubtedly, it'll be brought up. It'll be brought up very clearly. And again, if you go back to the 1990s and sort of study read the books of the first people who are trying to describe postmodernist thinking, that in the revolt of the elite and the elites and the betrayal of democracy, or also in John Ralston Saul's book, about the dictatorship of reason. There was some thought that there's going to be widespread opposition of the little people who just don't get it. So flash forward to Trudeau, who doesn't think himself as one of the little people, but considers himself to be tremendously enlightened. Look at some of the people, let's say, behind the Biden administration, that the complaints, are small-minded people who have to be ignored. The important thing is that you present yourself as being very, very modern, very, very progressive, far more in tune than they are. Of course, in Europe, but also, let's face it, I mean, you talk to your neighbors, you talk to the people in the cafes, you talk to the people you meet. Canadians have very different attitudes now about immigration than their government does. And that's very clear. And it's not that we're all racist, but it's very convenient for Trudeau to accuse us of all being racist. And again, if you look at France, which is on the edge of really fracturing, or if you look at some of the more quote unquote radical countries in NATO, like Poland or Hungary, their citizens are people who've learned in the new environment with some of the people who are flooding into their societies. You can get beaten up for giving the wrong answer when someone asks you to light their cigarette. You can get killed for looking at the wrong people. There's a new reality around, and they reject it. So there's a realism that's there, but it is an inconvenient one to the attitude and the customs of the political class. And I guess to another point, for example, 20 years ago, right in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we had our new anti-terrorism laws, 2002. We were constructing our new abilities to get out there and fight the Salafists, the Wahhabis, the new generation of very, very intolerant Muslims. And we were trying to find and to make sure that we were not excluding the Muslims that we want. We were just trying to get the extremists. But all of a sudden, that discussion diminished and disappeared utterly in the United States and in Canada. Instead, we invented a new threat. We had for years the Canadian government or the American government say, don't tell us about the Salafists and the Wahhabis. Tell us about the white supremacists. Well, they hardly existed. And let's face it, I mean, if you look 10 years ago at Canada or 20 years ago at Canada, you know, what we had, white supremacists did exist, but I mean, they couldn't organize a 2-car funeral procession without factional infighting. But now that they're a big, huge, sinister threat. And if you look, for example, the last time we updated the Gazette of the list of terrorist groups in Canada, we left off the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has a 40-year history of terrorism and violent activity, both inside Iran against Iranians, against Iranian dissidents abroad, and in support of terrorism in other countries. But we included the Proud Boys, who barely exist and don't have a record of violence in Canada at all.
No, I mean that's Canada through and through, isn't it? I mean, whether it's gun licensing or it's terrorist groups, it's always the little people and the people you would never have any problems with. They're the ones who get put through the rigmarole. It makes no sense. But welcome home to the freedom fighters.
Yeah, well, that's the same thing in Europe. Remember, that you started to get opposition, especially to the wave of Muslim immigrants, mostly young men, mostly from Pakistan, and again, Deobandis, Wahhabis, Salafists, were flooding into Europe with their own agenda, and people getting upset about this, and they were being described as white supremacists. Well, okay, it's interesting because these white supremacists in Britain and France were including Jews and gays and Hindus and other people that you would not expect to see, at a Ku Klux Klan rally in Georgia in 1950.
No, things they are changing. They just seem to be changing really weird.
Yeah.
This security question though of internally restive population. In January, we all witnessed an interesting phenomenon, a phenomenon that will be remembered for a long time, where the Capitol building of the most powerful government in the world, the most powerful government the world has ever seen, that developed the atom bomb, got us to the moon, etc., was breached and occupied for a short time by what did seem to be a majority, certainly white demographic, but nonetheless a majority of people who, as far as we can tell, the single linking thing of many of them was that they were most likely to be poor working class whites, a lot of them. And they breached the Capitol. They occupied it for a couple of hours. There was a fatality of one of the breachers, occupied rioters, however you want to say that, who was shot at point blank range by a security agent within the Capitol building. And other than that, things eventually went back to normal, and the votes continued to be counted from the states that would then certify who was the next president of the United States. And I think that instance it really hits me because, again, like we're talking about, the modern world, we're talking about the democratic West, and we're talking about a group of people that obviously felt so aggrieved at a variety of issues, not just the result of the election, that they felt righteous indignation. They breached the Capitol building. And I wonder if we're taking the right lesson from that, or if people are just, again, they're bringing up the whole question of white supremacy and everything else. They don't seem to be taking the right information from what happened here, which is that people are mad and they're not going to take it anymore.
Well, again, there's a number of answers to this, and some of the specifics to what happened on January 6th, which is definitely not the feast of the wise men. And then again, some of the generalities. But if you look at January 6th, there's a number of details that don't make sense. Trump supporters were listening to a speech by the president, being told by President Trump, and being told to behave themselves. Where you had all these people who clearly weren't. And there are figures who've been identified in that crowd that surged in the Capitol that, again, were not part of any pro-Trump movement that is recognizable, including that the clown with his bison horns and his weird headdress and all the rest of it. Some of them were people who, well, again, if you look at the motivations for terrorism, I know he's passed beyond academic respectability, but if you remember the old Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs, the top, the peak was the self-actualization. And often a lot of people who are drawn to the violent political movements are self-actualizers. They're people who want to do something famous, want to be remembered, break into heaven and throw down the high towers. And from 1,000 different perspectives, those were the first people in the Capitol. Sort of the mom and pop types, Joe Sixpack or however you want to call him, Joe the plumber, were not there or weren't there till later. And again, there's this famous footage of, some of the Capitol Police actually ushering some of these demonstrators into the U.S. Capitol building, which makes no sense. There are other things that have not been considered. For example, even 2 or 3 days before this happened, there were memos and communications inside the Capitol Police saying, there's a risk. We're not quite, there's some weird guys coming to town. There is a possible danger here. We should reinforce. And of course, that went to their headquarters. And who did the Capitol Police have to answer to? They're controlled by the office of the Speaker of the House. In other words, the ultimate person responsible for not reinforcing them, for not putting barricades up, is Nancy Pelosi. That doesn't come out very much. And of course, I'm thinking, because I'm a nasty, horrible thinker, I think in terms of historical parallels. It was like the fire in the Reichstag. We still don't know exactly what happened when the Reichstag burned, but it was awfully convenient to Hitler and the Nazis. And, you still have the barbed wire fences and the National Guard deployed in Washington. The January 6th riot was awfully convenient to the Democrats. It's, make of it what you will. We're going to be a long time getting to the bottom of what actually happened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're still waiting on what was going on in Berlin, and to the same point here, I think it was well said. I personally follow the Babylon Bee all the time online, both and their nonfiction side, which is not the Bee, because they still remain the best satire on the internet right now, and they've made the point of a party that says that military coup was going to take place, stages military coup and takes over the Capitol. This is precisely it. The Democrats have everything they could possibly want. They have all 3 branches of government. Well, they have at least 2. They have all 3 houses of government. They're waiting on the last branch if they expand the Supreme Court, and they have occupied the Capitol, and they have a fence around it. Like they're good to go. They're as safe as they could be.
Yeah, it's strange times, and again, if you start to really deconstruct things and look at things, you start to find that you're making common cause with conspiracy theorists, and you never would have, before, if you'd come listen to what was going on and you start to run into conspiracy theories, you shy away. And well, maybe they are right sometimes. They
make for good allies in any case. I'm thinking of probably most specifically, there was a tweet early on in COVID during the lockdown. It was an atheistic libertarian, doesn't bother going to church, doesn't care if people go to church, right? And suddenly they ban church. Atheistic libertarian begins going to church, right? Like, it's like, you can't tell me what not to do. Like, you can't take my church away from me that I didn't want in the first place. And so I think you find strange allies. You find strange allies. I think people are like that with all sorts of things.
Just as an aside, one of the things I did was I accidentally wrote a chronology of the Second World War. I accidentally wrote 2 versions of it, and I've just finished working on the 3rd version. I hope to get published someday, but when I was just about finished it the first time round, I got tired about hearing about athletes and starlets being described as being heroic for having fashionable opinions. So I studied my chronology of the Second World War with people who had achieved high distinctions, medals of honor, Victoria Cross, heroes of the Soviet Union. And some of the most interesting cases were people who'd actually been righteous among the nations, people who had Jews. And I put in dozens and dozens of them when you could tie them to a particular date, in the chronology. But the one thing it sort of gave me was a working knowledge of what it takes, to be heroic. When the one common impression I got from the righteous among the nations, where these were not people who were ideologically opposed to the Nazis. Most of them were contrarians. In other words, if they were told you've got to hate these people and hand them over, their common attitude for them all was like, hell, I'm not going to do anything of that nature. And so they started hiding people.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's the contrarians and the nuts that actually are the most heroic among us.
It's true. It's true. I mean, nobody tell the Vatican that when it comes to canonizing saints, but that's usually true. Usually the most controversial people. Coming back to Canada and what's happening here when it comes to what do you observe when it comes to our internal security, but either from threats, even domestic, but also from just the fact that we do have people who are doing clearly agitprop and all sorts of things inside of Canada. There are people who come here looking for monies for their fights back home for the ethno state. There are people here who are clearly influencing us. Clearly from China, there's lots of influence. What do Canadians need to do to try and arm themselves and protect their democracy from being influenced in a wayward fashion?
Well, the great Canadian tradition is to ignore the danger until it's too late. And that has been our custom for a very long time, except right around Confederacy, when we finally got the lesson that the Irish nationalists, were a potential threat because they invaded Canada several times. And, the Toronto Wasp militia had to, with mixed success, fend them away in a couple of skirmishes on the Niagara Peninsula. But it's also, if you look back at it, in Canada, we've had 2 political assassinations in 153 years, which argues a lot about the central decency of Canada. But one of them, of course, was the D'Arcy McGee, who was shot on Spark Street in 1869. He was an Irish Catholic politician who was killed by a Fenian. But if you say, for example, talk about the Chinese infiltration of the Canadian political system, have you ever read the Sidewinder report?
I have not.
Well, remember the initial draft of the Sidewinder report was being compiled, I think, around 1998. And it was about Chinese penetration in the Canadian political parties. And the draft got to the deputy minister, in the Attorney General, I believe, who immediately ordered the report destroyed and all research notes to be burnt. And accidentally and not on purpose, copies of the report fell off the backs of trucks to a lot of feet. I got a copy of it. And of course, CSIS picked, even though they were a target audience for this particular report, they didn't officially receive it, but they've been quoting it ever since. And you have a number of people in CSIS, in our professional circles, who know that the Chinese have been penetrating hard into Canadian politics. But you can't tell Canadian politicians that, or the media.
No, God forbid. You can't, and you couldn't possibly put it out there that there's clearly some honeypotting going on and clearly some arrangements being made in order for people. Well, I mean, it's money and sex. It's always money and sex. We all know that. But
this is Canada. It's all money, sex, and potential political support, voters. We got when the Tamil Tigers were busy, again, doing the same thing, penetrating into Canadian politics and running their community. You had a few politicians who were helping Tamil Tigers bring in refugees from Sri Lanka, from Tamil refugees. But that was also very clear that they were adding them into their own ridings as part of their voting base for the future. Yes.
Clientelism is as Canadian as it gets. As Canadian as U.S. gerrymandering. It's just it's like that. Americans have gerrymandering, Canadians have clientelism, and it's funny because it depends on what kind of clients you want to go get, as you're pointing out there. So I remember very distinctly. I went to Tradie Western, which was not at that time anywhere near wokeness. And nowadays, I'm guessing it probably still seems very conservative to many people. But unfortunately, I've heard that there's been some political correctness that has, to use your word, penetrated my alma mater. But the thing that what hit me was our one kind of well woke. Like he was a postmodern, and he used a postmodern interpretation when it came to historical issues. He took us on some, but he actually still took us on physical journeys around the Lower Mainland. We went up to Yale. We went saw where they dried the fish, and went at all sorts of places to talk about BC history. And one of the places we went was Chinatown, and in Chinatown there are historic monuments that show both Leninist and Marxist and of course Maoist, but as well as the nationalist heroes of the time that were trying to get money to bring back to China for the fight. So for the freedom fighting, so or whatever, however you want to put that, for terrorism at the time, like however you want to say that. So Canada having freedom fighters, that was one of the ironies when people were getting offended or encouraging freedom fighters to come back from ISIS or in the North Iraq, in the Levant, what was going on there. Canada's been having this problem for a long time.
Well, we've always had it. It was the Fenians in the 1860s and go on. If you look at the 1960s, we had all sorts of things go on. Croats who were still fighting against the regime of Tito, were a terrorist problem here. We had somebody who fired a rocket, an anti-tank rocket, at the Cuban consulate in Montreal in the 1960s. And then, of course, the 1970s and 80s, we had other foreign groups that were in Canada busy working for the cause back home. It's an old situation. I think the worst we ever had were the Tamil Tigers, who basically, most terrorist groups, or most big terrorist groups, eventually develop organized crime to pay for their activities, and it's part of the life cycle. If you look at some of the groups like the ETA, or the Provisional Wing of the Irish Republican Army, what you have is an organized criminal group that clings to the rags of the cause to keep running their enterprises. But with the Tamil Tigers, what you actually had was an organized criminal class in Sri Lanka that turned to terrorism as a money-making venture, and came to Canada and basically created or helped sustain the Tamil Tiger presence in Canada, and then fed off of them, for years. And finally, it got to the point where most Tamils were just sort of yearning to be free of this yoke, because it was costing them so much, and they were, the insult to their own intelligence. So it's an old situation, but what's also very, very different nowadays is that there's so many ways of making money, in so many different ways, and you don't actually need to create and run your own ethnic group anymore. You can do that in a number of different ways. The other problem, of course, is that the alphabet soup of agencies we've got. I talked about the CSIS and the RCMP, but if the FinTrack, the Canadian Border Services Agency, there's a dozen different organizations that are out there. When you talk privately to members of the organizations, they tend to know what's going on. But right now, the way they report to government, white supremacy first, and first, last, and always, and all the other ones aside. So I know some that are like privately keeping their own research files in the groups they've been studying for years, but they don't talk about them. They're waiting for a new reality to creep into Ottawa.
Yeah, a change in government, perhaps.
Yes.
With that in mind, election is probably imminent. Justin Trudeau is probably going to call another election soon. The Tories seem to be lagging, for lack of a better word. Or you could say some other really negative things there. They certainly don't seem excited. They certainly seem divided. And of course, Justin Trudeau, just like anybody would, instead of mourning the loss of the 215 children that were just discovered in Kamloops, has used there's really no nice way of saying it. on their bodies, he is planting a flag of righteous indignation that is all virtue signaling, and he probably will not actually do anything that'll help residential school survivors or anything else that's happened when it comes to residential schools, good or ill, because I think that narrative has also gone a very specific direction, which isn't always true. The point is that he's going to virtue signal like none other and try and steal the election with that basically as his modus operandi, while the conservatives are looking the other way.
I fear you are right. There are aspects of Canadian history that have been overlooked. For example, most of the government records about residential schools were destroyed under Mackenzie King in the 1940s. So, the only records that might possibly still exist, maybe perhaps, are in the Vatican archives. And now Trudeau's up there, waffling and huffing and saying that the Catholic Church needs to cooperate. And he's not mentioning the fact that it was actually one of the most famous Liberal prime ministers ever was responsible for the destruction of many of the records. And, there's a lot of other aspects of the context of the tragedy of the residential schools that have not come up for discussion. And that in itself is interesting. For example, if you, in Toronto, if you're coming off the Don Valley Parkway and you're coming into Richmond Street, one of the downtown streets, you go by one of the oldest Catholic cathedral in Toronto, and a big lawn there with a large part of it fenced off. And, a lot of developers have looked at that lawn and thought, about the stuff they could build there. There's about 8,000 people buried there on the grounds of the Catholic Church from a typhus epidemic in the 1840s. And again, most of the Protestant ministers, fled, but the Catholic Church was out, helping out with those who were, sleeves rolled up among all the sick beds and trying to deal with this. And that's forgotten. Smallpox. I've noticed, for example, if you go to the British Columbia Museum in Victoria, there's a reference to some of the First Nations in the 1860s had a horrible smallpox epidemic. Some of the northern bands killed half the people. The last, smallpox epidemic that the big one killed 3,000 people was in Montreal in 1885. And it's actually got a lot of interesting historical parallels because civic authorities and the Catholic Church in Montreal were suggesting that everybody get out and try this new medical procedure of getting themselves vaccinated against smallpox. And most people refused. They didn't trust the science, and 3,000 of them died, 2,000 children. These are aspects of our history we've forgotten. So we look at the residential schools and we look at the death rate, and it's horrible. But if you actually look at the StatScan records about childhood mortality in Canada in the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, it's pretty horrible across the board. I think the real crime with the residential school was not so much the death rate, it's the way it was handled. And that actually suggests the administration and supervision from the residential schools was being overlooked. But the records for that, especially from the government side, have all been destroyed.
I think that something that it needs to be clarified too when it comes to residential schools is that the government had contracted the churches to do this. And so it's funny now that the government's trying to throw the church under the bus as if it had nothing to do with what took place. And again, I think it's really hard for people to understand that the narrative isn't as clean and tidy as people would like to think. There were non-Aboriginal students there, for example. Some of those non-Aboriginal students have stories of abuse, just as there are many, many Aboriginal students and former students who actually have positive stories or just mediocre stories. They don't have tragic stories from that time. It's just it was a fact of life. This was where you went to school. This was how it was.
Well, the other thing is, if you look at the disease environment, the late 19th and early 20th century, you had two particular vulnerabilities. One is if you were First Nations and did not have in your genes the resistance to the old world disease environment that had arrived in North America. The other thing was that for example, the United States military, the United States Army in the American Civil War, they always wanted to recruit the country boys because they thought the country boys, were tough and fit and knew how to shoot. Where the riffraff from the city, were the people they didn't want to become soldiers. Then, of course, you look at some camp in like 1862 in the winter, and smallpox would roar through it. And it was the boys from the city that were surviving it. The country boys were being buried out back. So if you look again at the disease environment for some of these residential schools in the 19th century, the kids from the small towns, from the remote areas, and again, the country, were the ones who were, again, far more vulnerable than the cities, kids in the cities were. And again, it's a fact of life, and no one's ever done the number crunching on it. And it's something that should need to be done. But again, we've got a posturing prime minister and his movement that is preparing for an election, and context is not going to be discussed.
Meanwhile, on the conservative side of the spectrum, we have Aaron O'Toole, who has a base. I think he's essentially lost the base. I don't know if anybody wants to show up and vote for him. Not just on questions of social conservative issues or even gun issues, though he's definitely lacking there as well. But just in general, he seems to be an unexciting figure, which is odd because there was a moment there right at the beginning when being the member for Durham, a very working class part of Canada, a traditional automotive place in Canada, manufacturing base in Canada, one of the few that we have in this country, looked like he could be the guy from Durham who would beat the guy from Papineau. And he's lost this element and gone off and talked about carbon taxes and some other bizarre Canadian tire money machine. It's all gone all over the place while also leaving social conservatives behind. What is exciting about this character anymore? Like, why would anybody vote for Aaron O'Toole?
Yeah, I guess it's one thing that doesn't speak well for us. If you look at the Liberal Party, when Pierre Trudeau took his walk in the snow in 1983, you immediately had for almost 20 years a fight between the Desmarais group and the Earnscliffe group over who was going to be the power behind the throne in the Liberal Party. And it handicapped the Liberals for a long time, even though Chrétien was able to take advantage of the split between the Reform and later the Alliance Party and the Conservatives to win a number of undeserved majority governments. But the civil fighting between the factions of the Liberals finally died down when the New Kids took over in 2014, 2015, and Justin Trudeau suddenly became the leader of the Liberals. It's the Conservatives, though, again, factional fighting inside the Conservative movement that is continued. And you can throw up leader after leader, and there's a whole mess of ambitious people who all want to be the power behind the throne. And they've always got the knives out, whoever the leader is. So again, we couldn't get rid of Harper fast enough, and then we brought in his replacement. He lost one election, and the knives came out. Get rid of them, and we're not even waiting for the election before we stabbed the current leader of the Conservatives together. And again, there's all sorts of people who got their candidates in the wings and are waiting. Next election we'll finally have a leader that Canadians will rally behind. Someday the Conservatives are going to have to learn keep the knives away and focus on the leader and push. Because otherwise, we're going to get more prime ministers like Trudeau.
It's a valid point. I guess the thing that's a real disappointment here, everybody isn't what they seem. I mean, the honeymoon period ends. That's something that I'm being told a lot these days as I head for the aisle with my beloved. And that's part of life, and that's why the sacrament is what it is, and that's why the vows are what they vow. And likewise, between us and people that we're not married to, who we're following as our leaders, there is a certain sense of honor and responsibility, a sacred bond. I make no quarrel with that, and I don't quibble it either. But the question still becomes that if you're promising one thing and then you deliver something entirely different, like in your first press conference, no less, right? Coming out as I was the first pro-choice, candidate to be elected as leader of the Conservative Party, and everybody just stops. It's like that record scratch sound in a movie, and everyone's like, and they just all look at you and they're like, wait, what? Like, you're leading with that? Did you want to lead with that? You got like 2 seconds to take this back. And he doesn't. He just leans into it. I think that's kind of it. It was that it's not just a question of the abortion question. That is a question that needs to be solved in this country. And the court told us that in 1988. But the point is that he just seems to have really alienated just about every kind of major demographic inside the party, except the progressive wing of the party, which is very small as far as I can tell.
It's small, but it's also very traditional. But it was Harper who was pointing out, and this was actually just before he got back into politics, but I remember listening to a lecture of his in, I think, 94 or 95. And he talked about how actually the Liberals are united behind the prospect of power. But the problem for the NDP and the problem for the Conservatives is they're both big tent parties with a number of factions who are inside the tent. So the problem for the leader of the NDPs, or the problem for the leader of the Conservatives, is you're trying to unite all these particular factions and get them working together. And it's an extra set of challenges for both. The NDP leader is always got to work about the Marxists, about the Unionists, and about sort of the prairie, Saskatchewan farmers, who again have their own tradition. Where the Conservatives, you're dealing with the fiscal conservatives, the libertarian types, the progressive conservatives, and you're trying to keep them all together. And of course, in both cases, the NDP has a faction that scares the general population because most of us don't like Marxists. And social conservatives tend to scare a lot of ordinary Canadians. So you want them in the tent, but you also want them to be quiet so that they don't, and that's hard to do. So that's the traditional handicap that they both got to continue with. But of course, just sort of remembering there's one other line in the King James Bible I've always put a lot of stock in. Well, there's a lot I put a stock in, but put not your trust in princes. We've got a new leader. And again, there's a lot of people who always want to think of the new political leader, that the party leader is the new Messiah who's going to make everything perfect. He's the guy who's great. He's who we've exactly waited for. None of them is perfect. Mm-hmm. You're never going to get, a party leader that does everything you agree with. The best you can really do in every election is, hold your nose and vote for the party that annoys you the least. And if you're conservative, again, the current leader of the Conservative Party might not be a perfect leader, but he's the one they've got right now. And I just wish the guys with the knives would sit back and take it easy for a change.
Maybe a place to kind of wrap up then, John, is just that concept of I believe it was trying to remember who's the big Chicago school economist again. Why am I forgetting his name? Something with an M, right?
Well, remember, economics is something I've actually paid very little attention to. Just like
fair enough. But his point was that you don't wait for a Messiah. You get the wrong people to do the right thing. Exactly. And you can't. We won't get a Messiah in the Conservative Party. But we could get somebody who is competent enough to run the government for a little while and maybe push it back into a right-wing direction where we don't just spend money like it's growing on trees and we don't just tax the air we breathe. Maybe we can do that. And you're right. I agree with you that there needs to be some kind of cooperation along all the factions on the right that says, no, you know what, we have to defeat this menace and get something done here in Ottawa.
Yeah. Well, I could go into, von Clausewitz and his property of the subordinates. The ideal subordinate, just like the ideal politician, is an active, intelligent one. And then you want a lazy, intelligent one, who you say like Louis Saint Laurent, who doesn't do much, but is smart enough to know that he shouldn't do much. The worst is what we've currently got, an active, stupid prime minister. But at least with a lazy, stupid subordinate or a lazy, stupid politician, they won't do much harm. So please make your choices accordingly.
I think maybe the other one is C.S. Lewis said it well too. Something similar, right? It'd be better to live under a bad man than under a good man, or a man who is compelled by his conscience to do bad things or make bad policy, because at least the bad man will tire, the tyrant will tire, and the good man compelled by his conscience will actually never tire. He's a zealot, and he's a zealot for the wrong things.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
But I know you have to leave us at about this time, I believe, John. You had told me so. It's 11:30 Mountain, I believe. So I'll let you go. But I appreciate you coming on and explaining all the wide world to us again. We hope to have you on again soon.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. But this has been an ongoing kind of question when it comes to the federal election. What will happen? I think I'll take the last few minutes here and kind of dwell on that. Maybe I could actually encourage my beloved producer to bring up the polls as they stand right now when it comes to the Canadian federal scene. Yes, and to Claudette's point, John is a great guest. We're really appreciative to have him. John doesn't get the press he deserves, and we're happy to have him here to explain to us, especially the foreign policy part of things. Because I mean, that's what every channel needs, right? Every channel needs a foreign policy aspect. Every channel needs a domestic aspect. Every channel needs the various demographic constituents aspect. We all need that. So I think that we're gonna go here and talk a little bit about what's happening with polls and that sort of thing. It's kind of funky. Apparently there's a whole bunch of dots on this screen. I have no idea what's going on here. I just need some numbers, I guess. It's a whole bunch of weird dots on the screen. I don't know. I thought I was having a seizure for a second. Oh, there we go. Okay. So right now, as it stands, we'll put this on the screen share. So we're at 338.com. Which is like 538 in America, except maybe slightly more accurate. So bad for you, Nate Silver. Right now, the Liberals are in, I believe, majority zone with a 36 lead in the polls, and the Conservatives are behind them at 31, leaving the NDP down in the 17 range. And of course, the Bloc at 6 and the Green Party at 6. And the People's Party of Canada, which is listed here for some reason, at just below 2, and unlikely to gain a seat. Their projection, we'll just roll back up there a little bit for that projection. June 6th, 20. Hey, look at that. That says something different. Popular vote projection. No, so that was up there. This is predictability, vote projection. Yeah, no. So we're in the range. Bell curve's happening. Seat projection. Okay, 170 seats needed for a majority. And this looks like a still minority situation for the Liberals, but probably not. My guess is that they would get the 3 to 4 seats more that they'd need. This has got them pegged at 167. The Conservatives are at 114. The Conservatives currently have, I'm trying to remember how many seats Conservatives have. They have over 100, because it was a minority out of the last election. They have over 100 right now. And the NDP are down at 30, the Bloc are down at 30, and the Greens are at 2 point whatever. And of course there's 1 seat for Jody Wilson-Raybould. I forgot about that. Oh, and Jane Philpott. No, she lost her seat. Jane lost, but Jody stayed on. So here we are. Here we are, with a few minutes away from another Canadian election. And Pamela is making the point here that we have to vote for the party. The leader can always be changed. And as they used to say, like children's underpants, and often for the same reason. And then Daryl over here is saying something about electing a conservative, replacing him later if he proves against grassroots. Just get your conservative candidate elected. We don't vote for the leader. So Daryl making the point that we don't vote for the leader. And we don't. This is not a republic. we are not a republic. We are a parliamentary democracy, which with a constitutionally mandated monarchy. A lot of interesting comments coming in right away. People have got some things to say about the current federal situation. Decoy 11, which is a sheep with a mask on. I have sheep that look like that on the farm. Alberta Free Vote, Wild Rose. We must separate. I don't want to be the guy who has to say this, especially on the Token Sovereigntist channel. And again, I have said many times before that my attitude towards sovereignty is somewhat ambivalent. I believe that making threats around sovereignty is a brilliant strategy in order to get more out of Ottawa. Do I want the external borders of Canada to change? I'm still on the fence about them. But I'll say this. I don't think Alberta will get very far on its own separate. I think it needs the coastline from British Columbia, or it needs the coastline up in where I was last year, Churchill, Manitoba, and therefore it needs Saskatchewan and Manitoba to come along for the ride, which would be really interesting leaving BC all by itself. That would be really weird. It would look like all those, you remember those old maps you used to see in social studies class where the map showed like California when it was still part of Mexico and that sort of stuff, all that weird stuff back there. That'd be kind of interesting. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Why is the Bloc allowed to sit in the federal House of Commons when they only run candidates? Quebec, the Reform Party is not allowed because they didn't run candidates in all federal ridings. That's a fair point. I know the Reform Party had some difficulties getting off the ground, especially when it was fighting with Quebec, the Québécois. I think actually, if I were to be perfectly candid with you, a party like the Québécois, if they did run candidates everywhere, I think they could be quite successful, because I think the Québécois are pretty uncompromised in where they stand on things. It's like, no, we are here for Quebec first. It's like, well, you know what? If you had a BC first party and you had an Alberta first party, you might get somewhere with that. Maybe we should be 10 cantankerous cantons instead of just 10 weird provinces. I don't believe the polls, they are about as trustworthy as COVID numbers. That's a good point, Kirsten. I got to give you credit there. Also, I appreciate that you said the polls as if they were a people group. That was funny. Of course, we do trust polls. We trust our former Pope, who is now saint in heaven, John Paul II, and we do trust the polls. My dear friend Michael is a good Pole. He's a good guy. I lived with the Poles up north when I was in Churchill. The Poles were running the place. But polls with two L's, yes, we do have some questions there. Sorry, I threw her under the bus there. My producer's going to cut my feed pretty quick here if I don't shut up. All right, moving right along. No, I mean, this is the thing with the federal issue. Okay, like seriously, this is actually a good place to jump off. So people are arguing on the comments here. They're trying to say, well, which party should you vote for, and should we just vote conservative and then try and change the leader and get things figured out? Look, here's the deal. I really do believe, and we're actually going to have somebody on tomorrow who's going to talk about this when it comes to the nature of the voting system. I do think that there's a problem with the voting system itself to a point, and I do think that there's a problem, politically speaking, with the way that we've cut up this country. I really think that if we wanted to change the way this country works, we would actually have to redivide it. I don't think we necessarily need a secession inside of Canada. And that's, I know we've had this discussion before. There are people who comment here and there are people who watch this show that are very, very pro sovereignty. I've just tried to be honest with you. I've never tried to pretend I'm something that I'm not. I do believe in questions around sovereignty. There are serious questions that need to be debated, and separation and secession in Canada. I'm going to get into trouble for saying this. I remain a staunch supporter for the lost cause aspect of the South during the American Civil War, and that you can't have a federal government just tell you what to do with your life. You can't. And I remain a big fan of Robert E. Lee. I said so in my interview for the Canadian Forces way back in the day. I remember the captain interviewing me stopped me dead and was like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Well, he said he wouldn't raise his hand against Virginia. He wouldn't fight his own home. He wouldn't turn on his home." And that is where I stand. I do stand on that, regardless of any other complicating factions and factors there. I am a British Columbian first. That I'm not arguing that. And I'm a Western Canadian first before I'm an entire Canadian. But at the same time, I also think that we need to have a system that would be, well, equitable, that would not just leave us vulnerable to the foreign interests who are clearly interested only in our resources and not in helping us improve our country. And we have to be careful with that. And the smaller and easier to manipulate we make our political regimes, we could very well come under the thumb of China or the United States, even worse than we are today. And so I think we need to be careful about that. If I had it my way, I would keep the external borders of Canada the same, and I would recut the internal borders of Canada, because I think that whether we're talking about northern and southern Alberta, like you guys who are over in Alberta commenting here, like you guys don't agree with each other. You go talk to a Saskatchewanian, like who doesn't live in Saskatoon or Regina, like they don't agree with Saskatoon or Regina. Same thing with the rest of Manitoba and Winnipeg. The northern Manitoba, even though they might vote the same way as the surrounding areas of Winnipeg, they're all orange, right? No, you bet that Churchillians and Thompsonians do not agree with what goes on in Winnipeg, and they hate that Winnipeg gets all the attention. So I think that we need to redivide our provinces first, to tell you the truth. I think that would make a lot more sense and actually help us with our federal situation. I think that we probably should look like a map that's closer to the United States, which has 50 states. And Canada should have something probably in the range of 30 or 40, maybe even 50 provincial canton sort of things that have their own independent way of doing things. But we've got a few more comments here. The direction of our Ottawa Conservatives are going no different than the Liberal. I don't believe replacing the leader is that easy. Look at the issue in Alberta. Marcy, you've actually got a great point there. And the reason you've got a great point there is that in Alberta is actually the example. Probably also Manitoba. Again, no offense, Saskatchewan. I think his name is Moe still, Scott Moe. Yeah, I mean, again, the fact that I can't even remember who it is kind of shows how things are going there. Like, it doesn't really seem like things are going at all. But in Manitoba and in Alberta, we have a situation where we have two Tory governments, two right-wing governments with leaders that are now deeply unpopular for the actions that they've taken. And there doesn't seem to be a method out of there. So, I mean, Kenny, I don't know if Kenny should have resigned by now, but he's definitely had a problem for a while. The borders in North America should have been north-south and not east-west. It is true that there's probably more consensus between the Great Lakes and the Appalachians and the Laurentian Valley and the Maritimes and even probably down to the southeastern United States, not quite Florida maybe, but down to even Georgia or the Carolinas. That whole section of North America probably has a lot more in common than everything west of Lakehead and Lake Superior. I would agree with Pamela for the most part here. But at the same time, I do think the borders went the way they did for a reason. They weren't just entirely arbitrary, though they could have followed lines a little bit better. We probably could have had our border go down to the Missouri River, for example, and the headwaters of the Mississippi would have made a little bit more sense. For that matter, I mean, Minnesotans sound like Canadians, at least when they're in that far reaches of Minnesota. But I guess the short version on my end is that I do think that the borders of Canada make sense in a external fashion for the most part. We could have had the Columbia River Basin, that would have been nice too. We could increase those kind of areas of Canada, have that flow a little bit more sensibly. But outside of that, I think that when it comes to our internal borders, that's where things need to really be fixed, because Victoria telling the rest of us in British Columbia what to do just doesn't work for us. And honestly, even Vancouver doesn't like Victoria having the reins, and even Kelowna doesn't like Vancouver calling the shots. So something has to change there, and we can change it if we were willing to reappropriate and redivide our provinces into more sensible sizes and more sensible political arrangements. Need more people with principles, but values everyone, not just who gets you ahead of the game. I think the problem with political leadership, there's quite a few different things, but one of the big things that's a problem with political leadership is that, quite frankly, a lot of it is being done by, well, people who are just there to get ahead for themselves or are egotistical. But the fact of the matter is, too, is that I think we forget how little power the average politician has in his hands. And that doesn't mean that they aren't to blame for that. They've given away so much of it, and they shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. That was evil. It was wicked that they gave away so much responsibility. We did it in order to prevent there being abuses of power, right? That's why we came up with commission government. We have Stuart Parker on later this week. We can get into the commission government point again. He can explain it again and educate us more again on this question of commission government, where you have an elected group of people who are kind of just the final decision makers. They say yes or no to the final lines of the budget, but they don't really make the day-to-day decisions of government, and they don't really form the policy. That's all done by unelected bureaucrats. That's the problem we've had with COVID. That's the problem we have with the lockdown. That's the problem we have with everything. That's the problem we have with driver's licensing. The idea that I gotta pay $5 to drive my car around, like go pay a tax to have a license to drive my car, like I don't agree with it, but I understand why it happens. The idea that the state's going to be the one to make me a better driver and I got to go through graduated licensing and all the other things that have happened around drinking and driving, and the drivers who don't get penalized for that and never get caught before someone actually gets killed, while people who have just had one drink with dinner end up losing their licenses for a year and getting that stigma for the rest of their life of being a drunk driver when nothing even occurred. Like, all those things need to change. They need to change. But that's, again, it's all unelected bureaucrats, because who would you vote out on that question, and who would you consult with? Who makes those points? Policies are developed by unelected bureaucrats, and they don't answer for the mistakes in their policies. They don't answer for it. They get paid the same, whether they were right or they were wrong. And that's a problem. That's a really big problem. And that's how Canada is run. And it's the reason your municipal governments can't do anything right. It's the reason that your provincial governments are completely haywire. It's because they have, and the federal government too, the civil service runs it. And I don't even think the civil service is inherently evil necessarily. It's just that if you get paid the same at the end of the day and you have no connection with reality because you have a job that, again, that pays you the same. You've been working there 20, 30, 40 years. You haven't lost a job since you were a teenager. And that was because you were going to school and you left your job to go back to school. You have no concept of what life is like for everyday people, real people who have to pay bills and feed their kids and provide all the taxes that pay for you people. They don't care. They don't know. They haven't been there in a lot of years. And they form the policy, and that's the problem. So we've got a couple more. We have a few more suggestions. Actually, it's interesting. I've had a few. I meant in each country. Yeah, that's interesting. Pamela, just clarifying her comment there, splitting it down. We have Richard. Number of conservatives and liberals are members of the World Economic Forum. To acquire property, they plan to do it by force if needed. Well, I'll tell you this. I definitely think that the problem with our issues today is that we don't believe in small property ownership anymore. We don't believe in the freeholder anymore. I used to run a blog that was called the Yeoman's Corner. And that was the way that we kind of did it. It wasn't Freeman on the land or anything like that. We just called it the Yeoman's Corner. We used an old kind of photo. I mean, it was an old illustration from the Middle Ages of just of a yeoman, right? A bowman. Leaning up against something. And that's kind of where I'm at, I mean, Richard's referencing the agenda that's going on in the UN with trying to appropriate land. The biggest thing that I think we need to understand there is, again, the idea of us not just being a fiefdom and not just being serfs on someone else's property and having a lard and all that stuff and all that, and being a liege to call, that's relatively new. Most of the world, and still today, is still run on the concept of feudalism, which is that you live on a piece of property that's someone else's, and you work that land for them, or you work in their business for them. You do whatever, and you pay your tax, and so they just extract every ounce of value from you, and you kind of have the benefit maybe of having a family and a little place to call your home, which isn't really yours either because you keep paying taxes on it. Very true. People have no recourse against the unelected. We got this. Dr. Canada's not right. Just healthcare is so terrible. They get money no matter how bad a job they do. That's an interesting point. We don't have a ton of time to jump into that question, but I really believe in elected hospital boards. I really believe in this. Something needed to change when it came to the hospital board system that we had. But the thing that they changed was getting rid of the election. And that was a huge mistake. Huge. Because, of course, if you change the fact that there's anybody on that board that might be elected, anybody that the public can actually hire or fire, then you really just have, and the reason that people love being on hospital boards and everything, because it's just money, right? It's money, right? They're money thing. BC Ferries in British Columbia, money out the wazoo. The Utilities Commission, money out the wazoo. If you want to win the lottery, forget the lottery. Make friends with a politician who you know is going places and let him put you on a board, a moneyed board, not a volunteer one. I was on a volunteer board. I was on CNC. Our buddy Aaron Eckman was on UNBC. He wasn't getting paid for that. I wasn't getting paid for mine. I got like a stipend of like $50 a month or something. That you want money, like you get onto a hospital board. But then again, why would you ever be controversial if you're getting the money for doing that? We got Sheldon Jones here. So what happened to the political idea of conservative, smaller government? Last time I experienced that was with Ralph Klein in the 90s. He just corrected himself down here for the spelling of Klein, but no, we got what you were trying to say. And then Pamela making the point that same with W.A. Bennett in BC. We have to remember too that, and this was brought up on well, I can't remember if it was on this program or the other show that Aaron and I do, but it was brought up that W.A. Bennett also helped appropriate, BC Electric Company and turn it into what is now BC Hydro. So sometimes populist right-wing figures do some pretty, I don't know what else to say. It's kind of a socialistic thing. They definitely socialized. They nationalized it. They appropriated it. They took the company away from the shareholders and gave it to the people of British Columbia. So I don't know what you guys want to think about that, but that was a pretty drastic move. And it was for the benefit of British Columbia, and it was a great idea that continues to pay benefits to British Columbia today, provided that we stop running BC Hydro like complete crap. But that was a pretty serious maneuver. I've gotten pretty excited over here, and I'm a little all over the place between the comments and everything. But I think with the federal election, to come back to that, the issue is that there isn't any issues because of the interference being played by the media. So here's the real issue. Here's the way to vote in this upcoming federal election. Does your member of parliament want the lockdowns to end? Does your member of parliament agree with vaccine passports? And does your member of parliament think that the amount of money that we've printed through this entire escapade is totally okay? If your member of parliament is answering, yes to any of that yes, vaccine passports are great, everyone must be forced to be vaccinated, that the lockdowns were the smartest maneuver ever, and it was totally fine to completely change the economy on a dime. And finally, that speaking of dimes, the amount of money that we've printed, it'll be fine. We'll pay it back in taxes, or we'll pay it back. We'll just use inflation, and we'll be fine. We'll take care of it in a couple of years. If your politician is saying yes, yes, and yes to any of that, and not talking about the real threats to our democracy vis-a-vis foreign interests, particularly when it comes to China, and not talking about our economy in a sense of like, we need to try and keep jobs here, keep resource development here, and get to second and tertiary industries of how we take our own raw products and bring them to market. If your leader and your member of parliament is not advocating for you, the little guy who has bills to pay and a family to feed, if they're not advocating for that, throw them out. It's that simple. I don't care what color they're running under. I don't care what banner. I don't care what party. If they aren't fighting for you, the little guy, if they're not trying to give you more autonomy as a citizen of this country by giving you the economic freedom and if there are public services, the public services necessary to do what you need to do as a family man, a family woman, a wife, a husband, a parent, and as a young person hoping to become a parent someday, the wife or the husband of another, throw them out. I mean, throw them out. I mean, make a point of it. Put a sign on your lawn that says, throw him out, throw her out, get some new leadership, get involved in your local constituent situation and bring up whether or not this person should be allowed to run again. Get involved. Sign up yourself if you want to run. Sign up yourself, get the signatures you need in order to run, file yourself with Elections Canada, and make your voice heard. Get out there into earned media. If you guys run, if people like yourself run, no matter how unpolished you might be, I'll happily bring you on this program. You send me an email. We'll bring that up now, actually. You send me an email, and I'd happily have you on this program. You know why? Because we need more disruptors. We need more free thought. We need more free expression. We cannot continue to have the same boring policies over and over and over again. It hasn't worked. It isn't working. We used every tired idea under COVID, and it has cost us an exorbitant amount of money. I'm pretty sure the exact same amount of people died, regardless of your opinion on the deadliness of the virus. Whatever did occur throughout that pandemic, the exact same amount of people who would have or wouldn't have, depending on the lockdown. That it didn't work. It didn't help. It didn't change anything. Now we got the vaccine question. Now we got our civil liberties under threat with the passport. This is nonsense. This is not what, this isn't even the realm of government. Like, it's complete non sequitur. This country has infinite potential. And if you or any of your friends want to get out there and tell us what's really going on and how to do things, you know, we need to do it. We need to do it. We need people to get out there. And speaking of Derek Sloan, somebody brought up Derek Sloan. I'll just end on that. We have reached out to Derek. I don't know if anybody has a better connection with Derek than we do, but if somebody does, tell Derek to get on this program, because we've been trying to get a hold of him every now and again, and he hasn't had a ton of time. So, I mean, he's busy, which is fine. But somebody get a hold of that guy and tell him to come this way, because we'd love to have him on. So, and we'll leave it there. I mean, there's been some really good comments here. I'll end here with Daryl just making a point on Wacky Bennett. The CCF ran on a platform taking over BC Electric in the previous election, gained seats. Wacky saw the writing on the wall, informed BC had of winning more elections. He may have been right side, but represented the entire province. No, I completely agree. Completely agree, Daryl. No question here. You should come on the show and educate us on that question, same as Aaron does. We completely agree with that. That's the point, that sometimes you have to make popular decisions that are unpopular in the sense of, like, they aren't a direct correlation to necessarily your political principles, but you have to make the right decision that is the benefit for your province, your country, your region, your family, your community. That's how we have to be. That's how we have to be. It's not about having no principles. It's about doing that thing which actually does benefit all of us. So hopefully that's the political party that gets picked, because as it stands right now, the political parties we have are not helping us. It's all going so wrong. And we need to find parties that actually care about the people they're going to rule. I don't understand why that's so much to ask. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm ignorant. Maybe I'm young and silly, but I really don't believe that this is rocket science. I think it's very simple. If someone makes you their king, in a sense, because we have to remember that, in the biblical sense, like, that's actually what happened. Israel didn't have a king, and then someone was made a king. So not exactly someone who was just brought down from wherever, arose out of the mists, and suddenly they were in charge. They were actually elected. They were selected by the popular will of the people, at least in the first instance. And so the point that I would draw there is just that if you're a leader and you're listening to this broadcast, if you're somebody in your community that's in charge of anything, we're depending on you. We're depending on you very greatly. We can't run our own lives in their entirety. I can't pave the streets myself. I can't paint all the lines myself. I can't walk every kid to school and build every school over again by brick and mortar all by myself. It takes a community, and a community means organization, and organization means hierarchy, and hierarchy means leadership. And that comes with responsibility. So if you're a leader that's listening to this broadcast, it's very simple. It's very simple. We're depending on you. And we need you to do your job. And your job is to look out for us as best as you can, and to be honest about the tough decisions you face, and consult us and ask us, which way do you think we should go? You're the final decision maker, but you need to do this in consultation with the people that you have been elected to rule, to guide, to help. And we're feeling pretty alienated, and it's getting to the point where we don't think anybody listens to us at all. And that's pretty hard to take. So hopefully you're listening. Hopefully that strikes at your heart, and hopefully you resolve to be a better leader and to do more for the people who have put their trust in you. I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for tuning into Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede. We'll be on again bright and early tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. We're bringing on Bill Barnes to talk about a way that we might get some better leadership. That is to use the value vote ballot. He'll be telling us about it tomorrow, and we'll be bringing him on. So thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you tomorrow for Mountain Standard Time.